So my name's Dr. Sarah Pemberton. I am an associate professor in criminology at Birmingham City University. I am currently working on preventing sexual harm. So I've recently had a book out with colleagues, and also looking at the role of the police in supporting those who have convictions for sexual offending, and how they support that process of desistance in the community.
All right, lovely, thanks. And Alessia.
So I'm Alessia Bianco, and I work for Hestia and within the Everyone's Business programme. So I'm the programme manager for Everyone's Business, and we support employees and employers on their response to domestic abuse within their workforce and sexual violence in lots of different ways around policy support, training, advocacy, and how they can better support employees who might be enduring domestic abuse and sexual violence, or perpetrators within the workforce. So coercive control is a pattern of behaviour which is often designed to exploit someone or control them and create dependency within someone's life of that person. The Serious Crime Act that came into place on 29th of December 2015 made coercive and controlling behaviour a criminal offence, and sort of defined controlling coercive behaviour as either an act or a pattern of acts which is, exactly like I say, designed to dominate kind of all sorts of different facets of someone's life and make that person dependent on that person to not enable them to kind of leave an abusive relationship or not be able to make their own decisions. And then within that, there might be other elements of domestic abuse that fall kind of both within coercive control and otherwise. So it might be economic or financial abuse, psychological, physical, sexual violence and abuse, and other types that someone might also experience in conjunction with coercive controlling behaviour.
Sarah, do you have anything to
add? So all I would add is that I guess what coercive control, the term in itself, enabled us to move away from just seeing domestic abuse as a physical act. And so it came from the work, so the term was coined by Evan Stark in 2007 in his book Coercive Control, the entrapment of women in personal life. And like Alessia was saying, we saw it becoming a criminal offence in England not until 2015, so as part of the Serious Crime Act. And I guess it's looking in terms of how it's not about relating to a single incident, but it's about that continuous behaviour. It's about that pattern of behaviour, which we can see in terms of the controlling behaviour and the controlling parts, but also the role of coercion as well.
It's really interesting what you say as well about pattern of behaviour. A lot of people ask, how do I know if I'm in an abusive relationship? And I think that's something that people come back to a lot, is there being a pattern. It builds up over time. And that is a really important thing to remember.
And that often, I think for a lot of people that I've supported, what they would often say is that initially it's quite subtle, and we often talk about domestic abuse initially as being a grooming stage, much like we might talk about child sexual exploitation, and that the perpetrator or perpetrators will be often sort of grooming not just the person who they're being abusive towards, but their family, their friends, support network, so that eventually the only kind of narrative or voice that they hear is that of the perpetrator, or if there are family and friends who have been groomed, they will often be blaming and placing blame for the abusive behaviour on the victim survivor themselves.
That initial stage is often called love bombing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's definitely and definitely some people's experience of where a perpetrator will shower them with kind of affection and gifts, and when we see love bombing, often a relationship can move very, very quickly from kind of day one to quite quickly moving in together, or suggesting kind of making lots of over the top kind of shows of affection, but actually what's behind that, what's the motivation behind that, is in an abusive relationship to isolate, to be that person that then someone is completely dependent on to then be able to better coercively control someone. So I think in a way that's quite difficult to answer, because every abusive relationship is going to look completely different and it's unique to, you know, obviously that person and that set of circumstances. But there are some key kind of common denominators that we might see in coercively controlling relationships. One of them, like I've said, is sort of that isolation piece of people who are abusive wanting to isolate that person from sources of support, and that might be kind of in the workplace, it might be family, friends, colleagues, etc. It might also be, if someone is experiencing coercive control, that they start to find that they're not able to kind of partake in making decisions. So it might be all of a sudden someone saying, do you know what, you're not really good with money, so let me handle that. And in a kind of it's phrased as in a loving way or phrased in a caring way, but actually the motivation behind that is then to ensure that someone is economically and financially dependent on someone, which can fall within kind of coercive controlling structures as well, I would say.
Sarah, anything to add there?
Yeah, so obviously agree with the points about how it can often be quite gradual, and that abusers can often be very charming. And like you were saying, it's about not just charming the person within the relationship, but the people around as well. So thinking about family, friends, and then you get to this point about, you know, how friends and family, sometimes there can be disbelief that this is even happening because of that almost grooming, like Alessia was saying, that has taken place. I also think another interesting point is about, again, about the controlling and the monitoring and the role of technology within that as well. So if we think in terms of social media, if you think about tracking on iPhones, you know, being able to share locations, but obviously in the cases that we're talking about, it's about being able to monitor where people are going, monitor where partners are going, who they're seeing, accessing Facebook accounts, WhatsApp, Twitter, being able to communicate through those with people, so that the victims work with, for instance, and just that kind of the role that the technology plays in the abuse as well. So I think that's also something to think about here.
It's so interesting as well, you know, you touched on it, Sarah, earlier about how domestic abuse used to be seen as just something that was violent or that left a mark. And now, you know, when we think about the role of technology, all this monitoring, all this kind of almost stalking behavior, it kind of sounds like, is really moving away from viewing it like that. These really are not punches or bruises, are they? They really are very manipulative, very hard to put your finger on things that kind of come out.
Yeah, and if you go back to thinking about, you know, the definition that we've been talking about, it's the way in which that is used to control people, to frighten people, you know, thinking about the role of the harm that's caused. So yeah, it's looking at kind of the extension of the abuse and how abuse is facilitated in different ways.
And I would also just add to that, the continuation of that would be gaslighting, for example, making someone feel that they're losing their mind, making someone feel that they, you know, that what's happening isn't happening. And we see how technology and perpetrators will use technology kind of to continue that piece. One of the kind of newer things we've seen is the Apple, the AirTags. The AirTags that they were devised so that if you can't find your keys or you can't find your phone, you've got this little tag that kind of tells you, oh, it's here. But actually, like any technology, it can be exploited, and it's really easy for perpetrators to put that in someone's handbag or to put that in you know, somewhere else to then be able to track them. But if you don't know that that's what's happening, and then feeling like I'm seeing this person all the time, or they know where I am all the time, and then using that gaslighting piece of saying, well, how would I know where you are? You're being ridiculous. You know, that's something definitely we've seen a massive increase in over the last few months.
Yeah, so I guess I would say, it's about listening. It's about listening. It's about validating experiences, reassuring people that they're being heard and believed. I think that's really, really important, especially if you have an abuser that we were talking about has been, grooming the family, the friends. So I think it's about reassuring people that they're heard, that you're listening to them. And I think probably one of the kind of common mistakes or misconceptions is this kind of, well, why don't you just leave? I think, that there are many reasons why people don't leave relationships. That can be because of financial reasons. Can be because this is a person that they have fallen in love with, that there has been a relationship there. There might be children. It's also incredibly dangerous to leave these relationships. And so, what becomes really important is the support that's put in place if people make that decision, when they make that decision to leave a relationship. And I think that's the way in which the family can support, the community can support. And again, I would say things about directing people to services, such a service like Alessia's, thinking about the role of Women's Aid, for instance, encouraging people to go to the GP if if there's physical harm, or hospital. But I think the key one to begin with is about listening and reassuring people that they're believed.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think the most important thing is to believe people when they do reach out and when they take that brave step to reach out for support, because the majority of people will have been told either directly or indirectly by the person or people who are abusing them, no one's going to believe you. For all sorts of reasons, and eventually people will start to believe that, actually, am I worth being able to access support, but that it's not enough to just be that listening and believing person. Then being able to say to people, like, there are services, exactly like Sarah has said, that can support you and are able to do that. And one of the things that I think has made it fundamentally harder for a lot of people has been obviously the pandemic, and has been the lockdowns where we were all told, stay home because of pandemic and save lives. But actually, if home isn't your safe place, that became incredibly difficult. And one of the initiatives that did come up as a result of the pandemic is the Safe Spaces initiative, which still runs today. So currently, someone, if you're experiencing domestic abuse, you can go to any Boots, any Morrison's, any Superdrug with a pharmacy, TSB banks, and over 1,000 independent pharmacies, and go and ask to use their safe space. We've heard from people where actually they have a perpetrator, maybe they have children, and I'm just going to go to Boots to pick up some nappies. And whilst they're getting the nappies, they're able to use the consultation room in the safe space in Boots, and in the consultation room there'll be a phone or a technology device and a directory of services that they can access support from. And then they ask for ANNIE scheme as well, which is a heightened response to that, which ANNIE stands for action needed immediately. So and there was a case only last week where someone was prosecuted because someone went to Boots and said, can I speak to ANNIE? And the response there was the member of staff called the police, perpetrator was arrested, and now has a criminal sanction against them.
It's really great to think that the pandemic has actually really helped certain issues like this. I know obviously, like, initially keeping people at home is kind of probably an abuser's idea of heaven, because they are isolated, aren't they? So it's good to see that some charities have really reacted to this and given support that you can access quite easily in quite a, Boots is a normal place to go, so it doesn't really raise alarm to go there.
So basically, within the pandemic, we've seen a rise in cases. And so the thing, obviously, to take note with domestic abuse coercive control is we never have access to a true figure because of the hidden nature of this type of harm. So it is really hard to get a full picture on how many people this is impacting. victim. And so we collect data in two ways. So we're reliant on the police recorded data, and then we also use the crime survey for England and Wales, which used to be called the British Crime Survey. Now, the thing about the crime survey is that it's a victim report survey. And so it obviously samples across the population, and it gets people to comment on the crimes they've experienced over a particular time period. Now, the issue with this, with the pandemic, is it moved to a telephone survey. Now, obviously, we're talking about harm that's happening in the home, and this isn't something that you can talk about over the telephone when your abuser is potentially in the background. So that picture of data has essentially paused for this type of harm, and also sexual violence as well. So the numbers that we're working with, we've got the police recorded data, and so in terms of the police recorded a total of I think it was just under 1.5 million domestic abuse related incidents and crimes in England and Wales for March 2020 to March 2021. And that was an increase of just under 80,000 cases from the previous year. So you can see that during the pandemic, there has been a huge rise in cases, in recorded incidents by the police. Now, some people might account for that in terms of the police have got better at recording the data. For others, you might say, well, actually, it reflects an increase in this type of harm. And for the reasons that we were talking about people being locked in at home together, which for many is just not a safe space at all. The other reason, and again, it links back to our discussion about the role of the community, is that because everybody was at home. And so I think it was the Met Police that have reported that they'd had an increase in reports from third parties. So that is people such as your neighbours. And I think you can attribute that to the number of people who were at home during that time as well.
There were more people there to hear and witness things, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anything further to add on that, Alessia or Sarah?
No, I think Sarah said it all, really.
Oh,
yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, and yeah, it's just really, I just find it absolutely fascinating to think about the way that coercive control and the way that police have worked and everything's been affected by the pandemic in both positive and negative ways. This increase in reports, but also then that's actually been because there's more witnesses, there's more people around, and actually the community is reaching out and is doing the things that they need to do to support the victims of abuse.
And in the early days of the pandemic, I was talking to a police officer, and they were saying that they were being faced with the issue where they were going into the home to essentially make an arrest, but then you had perpetrators or alleged perpetrators who were stating that they were testing positive for coronavirus. Wow. And at that point, the police couldn't then take them into the police station. And so then it meant that the victim in that instance was being removed from the home. And again, that opens up that whole discussion of who's being penalised there. So yes, they're potentially being taken to a place of safety, but also the home is also a really important space for them as well. So again, it's looking at how the pandemic has played out in different ways there too. Yeah, so for me, I just talk about the importance of evidence, and that is what you need to secure prosecutions, but it's about how you safely do that. So, you know, because one of the suggestions would be keep a diary of everything that happens, because part of what you can do then is start to build up the pattern and demonstrate the pattern of the harm that you've been experiencing. But you've got to ensure that that is done safely, because if a perpetrator finds that, you know, that could increase the harm that's been experienced. But things such as being able to provide evidence, so thinking about emails, thinking about text messages, thinking about any kind of voicemail recordings or voice clips that are recorded on phones, photographs of any kind of injuries or damage to the property, thinking about if you've been to the GP or if you've accessed A&E. Obviously there will be medical records which will record any kind of obviously physical injuries, but also they hopefully will also document if the abuser was with you at the time, so who accompanied you to those visits to the hospital as well. Thinking about financial abuse, so any kind of bank statements that can possibly demonstrate that, and then being able to evidence about how you've lost contact with friends, with families, any kind of change to your day-to-day activities. So for instance, if you have had to leave the workplace, if you've had to withdraw from certain activities. So it's all about trying to build up that body of evidence which will demonstrate the pattern, the continuous nature. It will evidence control and it will evidence coercion. So it will evidence those behaviours.
Alessia, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think anything, thinking about, you know, is there anything that prior you were able to do kind of quite freely, and now you find that that's not something that you're able to do anymore, which can be quite difficult for people, because like we talked about before, it can be a gradual sort of process in terms of domestic abuse and coercive control. And being able to, yeah, like Sarah says, have some sort of a log or keep that evidence, but thinking about where is safe to do that. There's an app that sometimes people can use called Bright Sky, which is free to download, and when you download it, it comes as a weather app. You press the interface and it changes, and it's an app around supporting people who might be enduring domestic abuse, and supporting kind of family and friends, work colleagues, other people who might know someone who's experiencing domestic abuse. And one of the functions of the app is you can take pictures or send pictures, voice recordings, video notes, etc. You need a safe email address to send that to, and one of the things that we've seen is people using kind of either their work email address, maybe the perpetrator doesn't have access to, or someone else like a friend, family member, work colleague, line manager who is safe, and using that email address. And the app doesn't store any of that information. So if someone did see that, you know, that app is downloaded, the app itself doesn't store any of that information. And there've been some prosecutions in part based on that sort of evidence. But again, like Sarah said, I think any of those types of things, we would want people to really think about, like, how am I gathering my evidence, and is it as safe as possible? Because there's always the possibility that perpetrators are going to find that information, and then that could potentially increase someone's risk.
Okay, so when we talk about the Serious Crime Act of 2015, and in terms of thinking about what the threshold is for prosecution, what you need to be able to demonstrate with the evidence is that the offence is constituted by behaviour that has taken place repeatedly or continuously. The victim and the alleged perpetrator must be personally connected at the time that the behaviour takes place. And we'll talk in a moment about how that has shifted with the Domestic Abuse Act of 21. You need to be able to demonstrate that the behaviour has had a serious effect on the victim. So meaning that it has caused a fear of harm, a fear of violence, that it will be used against them. So they feared it, that it will be used against them on at least 2 occasions, and that it's had a substantial adverse effect on the victim's day-to-day activities. So that can be things such as the activities that they engage with, you know, things like going to the gym, or going to university to study a degree, or going to the workplace. So it's about how it has stopped those activities on a day-to-day basis. But also, they need to be able to demonstrate that the alleged perpetrator must have known that their behaviour would have a serious effect on the victim, or that the behaviour must have been such that he or she ought to have known that it would have that effect. Now, what the legislation has done in 21 is move away from that kind of personal connection. So when we were previously looking at using the legislation, it was about people that were in a current relationship with each other. And so for people that aren't living together anymore, but the coercion and the abuse and harm is continuing, the Domestic Abuse Act of 21 has recognised that. So we've talked about how, for instance, how abuse can continue when relationships have broken down, and that can be targeted with arrangements around children. It can also be extended to some of the financial abuse that we often see when relationships have broken down.
No, I think Sarah has said, you know, what the whole definition of coercive controlling behaviour is, and I think the only thing I would add to that is that it's really clear from the definition, as we've said, that it's not just about physical violence and abuse or sexual violence and abuse. That can definitely be part of someone's experience of coercive control, but it's, as Sarah said, around that regulation of someone's everyday behaviour, that monitoring, that kind of persistency, and it could be sort of threats. It could be kind of threats to harm that person and or others. So we often see threats to harm kind of other family members, pets, children, that could keep someone within that abusive controlling relationship, would fall under potentially coercive control as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's things like being able to demonstrate, so that you can demonstrate the continuous nature and the pattern. I think you have to be able to evidence 2 or more incidents.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to be able to demonstrate the fear that it induced, so fear of harm, fear of violence. And so again, when you're thinking about your evidence and the threshold for prosecution, again, those are some of the key things that you are trying to demonstrate.
And it can be really difficult if someone's been experiencing coercive control for a period of time. So they've been experiencing this for 6 months. How do they unpack? Because there's probably multiple incidents every single day that they are experiencing, but that is so complicated to be able to unpack, and to be able to unpack actually what is abusive and what isn't abusive, and what is just part of my ordinary relationship. If people have kind of previous experience of domestic abuse, that can be sort of tricky to navigate, and just kind of the fact that not every, all relationships are completely different, and what might be acceptable to one person in a relationship might not be kind of acceptable to another, and where that line is between an unhealthy relationship that might not be abusive, an abusive relationship that does have coercive control. So then when you're asking someone to kind of think about, gathering that evidence and think about the threshold, I think it can just get very, very complicated.
I mean, manipulation by definition is hard to put your finger on, isn't it? And if you're right, if you've been in a relationship for a long time, you kind of lose a sense of what is healthy and what's unhealthy, or what is normal and what is not normal. And you're right, it's hard even in a normal relationship to work out that, really, sometimes, isn't it? We are human, and we act in different ways, and we don't really know why, and it's like a human experience to act badly. But I guess the difference there is,
I still think that some people will go back to, but it's not that bad, because particularly if there isn't physical violence, but there might be the threat of physical violence, but it's not that bad because XYZ. It's not what I've seen, it's not what I know about domestic abuse or domestic violence, as someone might say. So therefore, why would I report, or why would I need to get support? Because and there's also an element for some people of, but I can manage the situation. I know kind of the person I'm with, I know kind of how to speak to them in a way that doesn't escalate things, whether that's right or not, whether that's incorrect or not, that some people might feel that way as well.
Yeah, it's quite like a coping mechanism, isn't it? Like, I am in control, I can help this person, or I can deal with these things that are coming my way.
Yeah, and again, I think that becomes of relevance when people are making that decision whether to leave something or not as well. Weighing all of those things up. and it gets even more complicated when there are children there as well.
I was going to say before, when we were talking about why doesn't she leave, or why don't they leave, it's kind of, I think it's hard enough to leave a healthy relationship. I'm sure people can relate to that, let alone if there is abuse happening, or if you've got children, if you've got animals, if you've got a home that you've built with someone, and that someone just turns out to be the person, not a person that you thought they were. It's additionally difficult to leave, I think.
And I think then when we start to think about so-called honour-based violence, when we start to think about, you know, potentially whole communities being abusive, kind of that can kind of get even more complex for some people. And the perpetrators are very well versed at knowing, you know, what pressure points to pick on. So if someone has pets, for example, and they've got a connection with those animals, it's very likely that perpetrator will make threats towards the pets, or will harm the pets as a way of kind of keeping that person where they want them to be.
That is something we put in the show, actually. There's like violence against a fish, but a fish that's very beloved by the main character, and so yeah, pets do take a role in the show as well. I think anything that the victim loves or cares about, it's a kind of gradual chipping down of those things, isn't it? Or